I'm going to share my screen to take you through some of the slides and the graphs and findings from our recent report, in which we sought to really shine a light on the state of housing affordability in the country, how we got here, and look at the entire housing ecosystem. And we've called it tackling a wicked problem for reasons that, as Brendan's just shown, as I hope I will explain further, will become clear. We think of ourselves as a nation of homeowners, but if you actually look at this graph, you'll find that Australia is falling quite behind in terms of home ownership compared to other OECD nations. We're well behind the OECD average on the number of households that own their home outright or even own with a mortgage. If you actually look at those countries where home ownership is lower than it is in Australia, they tend to be countries that have a very high mix of social housing across the population. So home ownership is not as fundamental a plank in their housing security as it is in Australia. So this myth of Australia as a land of homeowners is rapidly declining. We have now, amongst the least affordable housing markets in the world, in the top 12, we have 3 of them. And this is in terms of median house prices as a multiple of median income. And we're really, Sydney's only outstripped by Vancouver and Hong Kong, and anyone that knows anything about either of those cities should find that pretty disturbing. We know now that the number of owners without a mortgage and owners with a mortgage is declining compared to historical norms, while renters from private landlords are going up, and that's due to, as Brendan said, a lot of more people being locked out of home ownership, getting into the market in the first place much later. And so ownership rates now are in decline, as we can see that the historical sort of average from throughout the post-war years, huge investment in not only building social housing, but encouraging the construction of private housing and home ownership being a really important part of that post-war settlement. But since the sort of turn of the 20th century, we've started to see something of a decline. If you can hear that in the background, I apologise. It's my dog, who's called Chifley, who is scrambling at the back gate to be let in, but I'm not letting him in. So if we project out, we can see, as Brendan said, there's no real sense that Australia will fall to a position where a minority of people own their own home, but a drop of around 10% in half a century is quite significant compared to our historical average. And as you can see, depending on when you were born, your likelihood of owning a home is falling further and further behind. So it is becoming a generational problem that house prices have escalated in terms of their relationship to wages and income, to the point, and I won't labour this point because Brendan made it very clearly, that we're becoming a country, unlike the great Australian dream, as we've always called it, or the promise of Australia, as the most recent former Prime Minister liked to say, is falling away for a lot of people, and that unless you do inherit some money or win tax lotto or something, you are much less likely to be able to enter the housing market as a buyer, certainly before your midlife. One of the things that's really important here is thinking about housing costs. So the way that we treat housing in our economic debate is very much as an investment, as an asset, rather than a shelter. And one of the things that the DNF Housing Enterprise Foundation wanted us to do was demonstrate the impact of that shift away from seeing housing as shelter and as something that was essential as a home, and more towards an asset class, which it's certainly become over the last 30 to 40 years. And what we see, and this is not unique to Australia, it's a function of inequality, which will always exist in an economic system, is that the lower your income, the higher the share of that income goes on housing costs. Now, if you are a very wealthy person and you're paying 30 or 40% of your income on housing, you'd be living in a pretty spectacular palatial mansion of some sort, and I wouldn't feel too sorry for you. But for low-income people, and particularly those in the bottom 20%, but those in the bottom 40% as well, paying increasingly up to 30 or 40% of your income on housing does, as Brendan showed, lead to not just immediate poverty, but lifetime financial insecurity, and leads to lower outcomes in retirement. One of the pieces of work that my colleague Matt Lloyd-Cape did a year or so ago, and that we're developing further, is looking at mortgage costs as a percentage of single annual income over the life course. So one of the arguments that a lot of people make about why we shouldn't be too worried about young people today, at least until the recent interest rate hikes, was that while it is while house prices are very high compared to household income in the past, with interest rates so low, the cost of servicing that mortgage is not much different than it was in the early 90s. Sure, you've all heard that. And many people complaining that young people today just need to suck it up and save harder because, in the early 90s, interest rates were 17%. And what we did was went back and looked at the mortgage cost as a percentage of lifetime income per generation. So we found that a silent generation family, so pre-boomer, someone buying in 1970, would pay around about 11% of their lifetime income on servicing that mortgage. By the time someone of my generation, Gen X, came to buy, say around the year 2000, I wasn't quite that organised, but a bit later than that for me, you're looking at closer to 25% of your lifetime income to service that mortgage. And we expect that again to go up for millennials and Generation Z. And again, we're tracking that progress. So even though interest rates are very low, the cost not only of raising the deposit, but of paying off such a large loan compared to and this isn't just about house prices, it's about wages and the lack of wage growth, and the two are inextricably linked, will mean that you'll pay a much greater proportion of your disposable income on housing. So often when we hear these kind of intergenerational arguments, people ringing up talkback and saying, well, my wife and I never went to Bali and we didn't go out and eat avocado on toast and that's how we bought our first home, ignores the fact that the cost of going to Bali and the cost of going out for a meal now is proportionally much less than it was in terms of the proportion of your income in the 1970s. But the proportion of your income going to housing is much higher. And of course, holidays in Bali and avocado on toast in a cafe are discretionary spending. Having a roof over your head is not. It's essential spending. And so that's where that shift has occurred. The median size of the Australian mortgage is now just under $600,000, the median size of a new mortgage. I personally know people in their 30s that have taken out mortgages of $1 million or more. And if you think about that, the interest bill on a $1 million mortgage is around about $445 a week. That's the interest alone. And so this is a significant impost on people's ability, not only to save for other things, to spend their money on cultural pursuits, but also for productive investment in our economy. Now, Brendan touched on rents, and I think it's important that when we talk about housing, we don't just talk about home ownership, although that has traditionally been the Australian frame, because as you've seen from Brendan's previous graphs, there'll be an increasing number of people that will not only rent into midlife, but will continue to rent throughout their life. And rental costs have increased a staggering amount over the last couple of years. Again, COVID has had a big impact on this, and the increase in both property prices and rental costs has been uneven across the country. But in some markets, for example, Brisbane, for example, has seen their rental costs go up by 1/5 in the last 12 months. These are significant imposts on people that are unable to buy their own home and are renting in the private market. And we've seen just in recent weeks, a lot of coverage of people, not just in flood-affected areas like Lismore and the Northern and New South Wales Northern Rivers region, but throughout regional Australia, unable to find a rental property, and people outbidding one another, offering 6 months rent in advance, families that with young children that can't find a rental property. At a time when we're looking at a severe labour shortage as well, and the government's talking about potentially increasing migration to fill some of those labour shortages, we should be very concerned about where, as my friend Janet McCalman said to me last week, where these this influx of workers are going to live. I'm just going to skip over that because so social housing, and Brendan again touched on this. I think this is a really significant issue. And like the Grattan Institute, we were pretty chuffed to have some input into the Labor Party's thinking around social housing that it took to the last election. And while I think the Future Fund is a solid idea, particularly because it will allow a pool of funds to be constantly drawn on, particularly for repair and maintenance of social housing, as much as construction of new social housing, we do need to think bigger about how we invest in social and affordable housing. Brendan said there, we're not the UK. And that's a shame in my view, because I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for the investment in council housing that was done after the Second World War. That wasn't just for people at the bottom of the market. There are people that live in those supported council houses, as they're called in the UK, well into what we would consider to be a middle class life. If you look at how we've dropped, though, in the early 1990s, social housing made up around 6% of our housing stock. It's now less than 3%, and that's due to a significant drop-off of investment, but at the federal level more than anything else. States certainly have played their part, and they've been playing catch-up in recent years. But since the 1990s, there has been a real decline in terms of the investment by federal governments in building social and affordable housing. And by that, I don't just... Social housing includes, of course, community housing, which is operated by non-profits, but also essentially public housing, which is operated by the states. And some of those groups that Brendan pointed to as being the most marginalised in our housing market, people with substance abuse issues or mental health concerns and so on, are really best served by public government-operated housing. And so we do need an increased stock of that as well. So I am heartened that we have a government finally again talking about investing in social housing, but we will need a significant build in that space, and particularly looking at the regions where there's a lot of inappropriate housing. There's a dearth of smaller properties for older residents to move into. There are a lot of asset-rich, income-poor people in the regions that would like to downsize if they could stay in their own communities and then free up that house for a family. We're not building, again, the right type of social housing. So when we think about building social housing, we really need to think about making it accessible, and so that people can age in place, and so that it accounts for different levels of ability and accessibility. Mortgage stress is very high across the country now, and particularly, again, it's in those regional and low-income electorates, outer suburban, outer metropolitan, rural electorates, that mortgage stress is concentrated. And unaffordability as well of rent is similarly in those regional and our suburban areas. And we're seeing this grow. Again, it's been lumpy due to the impacts of COVID, but it follows generally the trends of where we see wealth and income inequality. Australia's household debt as a percentage of GDP is world-beating, and that's nothing to be proud of. We hear a lot about public debt. We don't hear nearly as much about private debt. And actually, if you look at our 30 years of miracle economic growth prior to the pandemic, most of it was built on two things: on immigration, on bringing more people into the country to keep productivity moving without necessarily increasing household living standards, and on massive amounts of household debt, households taking on debt essentially to buy property. We now have a residential property market that's worth over $10 trillion. And so along with super, it's a pretty big chunk of our national wealth. And that wealth is not accessible when it's tied up in property or it's tied up in super. It's not accessible to improve our lives now. It's also true that our retail banking sector is incredibly overexposed to the residential property market. 60% of retail banking activity in Australia is residential property, compared to about 20% in the UK. So we've really created a housing market that is too big to fail. And one of the challenges we have here is if we do take the actions that are needed to make housing more affordable and accessible, this will have significant on-flow effects, not just for the stability of those households that are highly over-leveraged, that have entered the market in the last 5 to 10 years and taken on a lot of debt, maybe for their first property, but maybe also for investment properties, but also of our banking system as well. So some of the nervousness around the political difficulties of doing some of these things is quite well-founded in terms of how shaky and how reliant our economy is on that household debt. This is a killer slide for me. We hear a lot about the impact of negative gearing on house prices, but what we found with our research and really dived into this, it's the capital gains tax discount that made the biggest difference. And if you look at when that was introduced in 1999, that's the point at which house prices, or really land values, it's land we're talking about here, took off compared to average weekly earnings or wage growth. The capital gains tax discount was introduced by then Treasurer Peter Costello and Prime Minister John Howard, with the promise that it would stimulate investment, productive investment in the productive capacity of the economy. What it actually did was encourage people to speculate on property price gains and park all their money in quite an unproductive asset, which is housing. And we now have a situation in which investors really are the only people that are benefiting benefiting from the structural tax settings around our property market. Around 2 million Australians, that's all, own more than one property. You would think it's a lot more than that, hearing about mum and dad investors, but it's only about 2 million Australians. Another 11 million own their own or are buying their own home. But if you think about it, they're not benefiting nearly as much from the increase in house prices, because in order to realise that gain, that wealth, it may make you feel wealthier, but in order to realise that, you either have to sell your property and buy another one, or sell and rent, or you have to take on further debt to draw on the equity in that home. Really, only people with more than one property are doing very well out of the tax settings that encourage speculative investment in residential property. If you address the capital gains tax discount and its distortive effects on the housing market, negative gearing more or less would take care of itself. You don't buy a property knowing that you're going to make an annual loss on it that you can write off against your other income, but you're still making a loss, unless you're expecting to realise a significant capital gain and have that gain concessionally taxed so that you're getting most of the benefit. And so to us, on the demand side, capital gains tax is the big challenge, not only in the way it's distorted our housing market and encouraged people to pour money into housing as a speculative investment, but in that it's taken investment away from more productive activities in the economy. It's discouraged us from perhaps investing, as people in other countries do, for example, in startups and in more innovative and productive activities and assets. And when you look at the distribution of that capital gains tax discount, it's almost all going to the wealthy. So 73% of capital gains tax discount benefits go to the top 10% of income earners. Very, very few of those benefits go to lower income earners. Negative gearing is a little more evenly distributed, and that's because of, as Brendan called them, mum and dad investors in the sort of middle income bracket that are using negative gearing to build assets for retirement, and they will hold on to those assets and maybe cash out later in life, or keep them as an income generating asset. But the capital gains tax discount benefit overwhelmingly goes to the wealthiest. There you see the negative gearing benefit a little bit less skewed to the top. So what we think are the principal drivers of housing and affordability in Australia. Certainly the CGT discount is at the top, and the loss quarantining rules. Our negative gearing regimes much, much more generous than just about, in fact, than anyone else's in the world now, since New Zealand has reformed theirs. So there are countries that have negative gearing, but they only allow you, for example, to write off your loss against other property-based income, not against your income from labour, for example. Low interest rates have clearly been the big driver over recent years, particularly in the last decade. But as we have shown, they have only been of benefit because of that initial encouragement, particularly the difference between Australia's crazy takeoff and house prices around the world, which have certainly grown due to low interest rates. But Australia poured the low interest rate fuel onto the fire that was already lit by creating a significant incentive for wealthy people to park their money in a concessionally taxed capital gains vehicle. We also have limited alternative tenure models, and this is something our report went into quite some detail. The idea that how home ownership is somehow productive has been put to me by some people to say, well, when people have housing security, they can get on with their lives and invest in other things and build wealth other ways. But housing security in many countries doesn't rely on owning one's own home, and that's where we see things like build to rent, large-scale institutional investors coming into the market. As Brendan touched on, one of the interrelated things here is that what makes our tenancy laws so insecure and our rental market so insecure is we do have those 2 million or 1.5 million of those mum and dad investors who may only own one or two investment properties but want the flexibility to be able to sell, because really it's the capital gain that they're chasing, to sell or to change their property portfolio when the market benefits them. So that reduces the incentive or the ability of tenants to have long-term tenures, to be able to treat their house as their home, and to really feel that they've got lifelong security and can build a family, even if they're renting in the private market, as they can in many other countries. Rent controls, cooperative models, something that's taking off around the world, cooperative housing models, particularly in the UK and Europe. Our finance and lending laws here make that very difficult for anyone in a co-op to access finance, even if between a number of people they have adequate capital and they have an adequate deposit. The financial models of our retail banking system don't support that option at the moment. And certainly a lot of the build-to-rent products that are coming onto the market now are very high end. They tend to be, apartment blocks in the inner city with a concierge and a pool and a bar on the roof. But what we actually need is a significant amount of affordable housing located in key workforce areas, particularly for key workers like nurses and teachers and ambulance officers. Obviously, low wage growth is a big challenge here. Ancillary factors driving housing and affordability. Low wage growth is a challenge. The inability of wages to keep up with house prices, so that we are now in a situation where the median house price is about 6 to 7 times the median income, compared to about twice the median income 30 years ago. Lack of adequate tenancy laws, although some states are starting to address some of those. And of course, the big elephant in the room, which is the zoning rules and town planning. A lot of our development is driven by what developers want. And so we have this paradox where we have huge suburbs with large detached houses where we could have more density, and then overly dense student accommodation in the city. And what we really need, and where Brendan and I agree on this, is in those middle ring suburbs, a kind of medium density build that would allow people to have family-friendly homes, but that aren't necessarily on the 3/4 acre block. And then really what we're looking at ultimately is we have a failure in this country of housing policy to gear the benefits of policy intervention to those who are most disadvantaged in the market. Quite the opposite. The benefits of our housing policy are geared to those that are already advantaged. And that's because we see housing right from our public discourse right through to the way that we measure the cost of living as an asset rather than as shelter, as an investment rather than as something, than as a home. And so I think what we found with all of this work that we did with V&F Housing Trust was the need to really rethink how we consider housing in our public policy mix, and that it is a wicked problem. We can't just do one or the other thing. And Brendan's chart there that showed the difficulty and the political difficulty of different changes, I think is reasonably accurate. But I do sense a shift in society over recent years in that even those of older generations who may have done quite well out of existing housing settings are recognising that their kids may not own a home, or that they may be using their super to help their kids buy a home. A really interesting statistic from some research by Rachel Ong for the Australian Institute of Family Studies a couple of years ago found that when we introduced a universal super 30 years ago, less than 10% or fewer than 10% of people who were buying their homes still had a mortgage debt at retirement. That's now up to close to 50%. And so people are actually using their super to pay off their mortgage or to help their kids into the market in the first place. And so we have this enormous chunk of Australian wealth tied up in residential property, and too many people locked out not only of being able to buy a home, but even of being able to rent a secure home near to where they need to be for work in time for them to start to raise a family, and an absolute dearth of social housing for those most in need. And the housing that is available through our social housing system is often poorly designed, poorly maintained, and inappropriate for the needs of people as they move through life. So it is a wicked problem. I don't think it can be solved by tinkering at the edges. I think urgently I would agree that one of the things the Albanese government could do to support low-income people, and particularly older people trapped in rental poverty as they retire is to lift the rate of Commonwealth rent assistance quite urgently. But over the longer term, that just exacerbates the problem because we're basically throwing taxpayer money to subsidise the rents that ultimately go to landlords and to investors. And the entire system is geared towards supporting those investors that already have much. I would like to see a significant increase in social housing investment in the building of social and affordable housing and public housing. We need to radically rethink the way that we allow planning to occur and allow developers to dictate planning and get more communities involved in co-designing planning in the regions in particular. We need to incentivise build to rent large institutional investors, for example, industry super, who are looking for reasonable, long-term, sustainable, reliable returns on their investment rather than fast growth and capital gains. And we need to also build significantly more medium density housing in middle ring suburbs and in major cities in the regions as well. But we cannot shy away from the fact that our tax system is heavily geared towards supporting those who already have much. And that really it's only the 2 million Australian households who own more than one property that are currently benefiting from that tax regime. And although no major party is now talking about looking at those property taxes and looking at those tax concessions over time, I do believe there's an appetite and an understanding that we can't continue with actually a tax system that across the board is not fit for the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century, and that the housing tax policy will have to be a mix of that discussion sooner rather than later.